Let's talk about the second Cold War. And I guess a broad question I have is, what should U.S. policy, and for that matter Western policy, but U.S. policy be toward China in this second Cold War?
The key point is that in many ways, there's a big difference between Cold War I, which was with the Soviet Union from the late 40s till the mid 80s, and Cold War II, which is primarily with the People's Republic of China. And the key point is that the Chinese economy is much larger in relative terms than the Soviet economy ever was. I mean, the Soviets barely got to 42% of US GDP at peak. The second and related point is that we do a hell of a lot more trade with China than we ever did with the Soviets. And so there is this intertwining of the economies that really wasn't a feature of Cold War I. And that means that we have to approach the challenges of Cold War II somewhat differently. And I think to give them their due, the Biden administration has understood this, and they have been pursuing a primarily economic or technological containment strategy. It's containment as in Cold War I, but the emphasis is on the technological rather than the military. And I think that's warranted, considering that a military showdown with China would be extraordinarily dangerous. And I think particularly at this time, it's to be avoided at all costs.
Is it possible, Neil, to have a bifurcated strategy, which is containment when it comes to technology, but not when it starts to trade? I mean, we had this talk about disengagement. People backed off of that. And then there's this de-risking, right? Because we have to be involved to some extent. For the reason you said, the Soviet Union was not that major a player in the global economy.
I mean, we had to, of course, restrict technology transfers to the Soviet Union if we could. But the Soviets were pretty good at stealing, say, the keys to nuclear fission. So there was some element of economic or technological containment in Cold War I. But I think what's been striking about the last decade or so has been the shift in American attitudes. If you go back to the late Obama years, there was almost an acquiescence in China's rise. The last national security strategy of President Obama's second term effectively recognized that there was no stopping China's economic rise. And that all changed in 2017 when Donald Trump's national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, redrafted the U.S. national security strategy and emphasized that China was now a rival, a competitor, and needed to be seen as such and treated as such. Trump himself favored tariffs as a tool, and I think the tariffs that Trump imposed did something to check China's growth, though they remain highly controversial amongst economists. But what proved to be more important were the technological measures that began by targeting Huawei, which was on the point of taking over global 5G networks. Interestingly, Joe Biden's administration did not radically change tack on China. It basically took Trump's policies and developed them. They didn't lift the tariffs. And on the technology front, the Biden administration, under Jake Sullivan's direction, I think, proved even more effective at applying technological containment to China, most obviously with respect to semiconductors. One of the big aha moments for me, David, of the last decade was realizing that China was spending more on importing semiconductors than on importing oil. And that has turned out to be a kind of Achilles heel for the Chinese economy. And the Biden administration has taken that Achilles heel and given a real hard kick, if not a spear jab, with the restrictions on the export of sophisticated semiconductors and the things you need to make them to China. That's really set China back, particularly in the competition to develop artificial intelligence. It's not that the US wants China to stop growing. It's more that the US wants to prevent China acquiring technologies that could pose a real threat to US national security. And I don't think there's any question that artificial intelligence has powerful and potentially very dangerous applications in the military domain. So this is a technological containment that I would say is intended to prevent China establishing parity or even leading the United States in areas such as artificial intelligence, or for that matter, quantum computing. I don't think the US would mind at all if China's policymakers decided to grow Chinese domestic consumption and allow Chinese households to enjoy more of the fruits of their labors. Chinese policy has pivoted in the last year towards a new manufacturing export drive that threatens to overwhelm the world in electric vehicles, batteries and solar cells that the Chinese can manufacture much more cheaply than anybody else. And that's not really a policy with which most Western policymakers are comfortable. I mean, it's one thing to compete with the US or Europe when it comes to apparel or footwear, the stuff that China did early on in its meteoric rise. But when you go after automobiles, I think it's clear that there's just a greater political salience. We had one big China shock in the early 2000s after China joined the World Trade Organization, and it took out a lot of Western manufacturing capability. I think the prospect of a second China shock that basically eviscerates automobiles, for example, is not one that many policymakers in Europe or North America are prepared to accept.
What does Cold War II mean for the climate? Because, for example, if you're talking about electric vehicles, you're talking about solar panels, we might be helping the climate by importing a lot of inexpensive, relatively inexpensive green energy out of China, and yet we're saying we don't want to do that.
Well, the Chinese love to say that, and that's the argument they make. We're producing all of these electric vehicles, and we're producing all these batteries and solar cells, and you're putting tariffs on them. You're not doing enough to save the planet. And the correct response to that is, when you manufacture these EVs and these solar cells, what is it that you actually use to generate the electricity? And the answer is coal. And the reality is that China has been the leading consumer of coal over the lifetime of Greta Thunberg. I think that goes back to 2003. A massive increase in coal consumption globally. About 80 to 85% of that increase has been accounted for by China. You're not saving the planet if you're buying electric vehicles from China that are manufactured with electricity that's produced by burning coal. That is, I think, a pretty good definition of the law of unintended consequences. And that's why I think it's right for the US and Europe to push back against this great wave of Chinese exports. It's not going to save the planet if they're building new coal-fired power stations every week of the year, which right now they are.